Now, it's been 1100 years since the Kokin Wakashu, a collection of ancient and modern poems, was compiled.
First, the background. The collection came after and was an attempt to hold out against the out-and-out infatuation with famous Chinese, which prevailed in the 9th century, the first 100 years of the Heian period. In literature, kanshi, Chinese poems composed by Japanese, but exactly in accordance with Chinese versification, had been held in the highest esteem. Emperor Uda and Emperor Daigo, his son, wanted to remedy this situation and to elevate the status of waka, or Japanese poetry, to the level of Chinese poetry by, for example, holding uta awase, Japanese poetry matches, as opposed to shika awase, Chinese poetry matches, and ordering the first royal anthology of waka, the Kokinshu.
Now, what about the form and format of this collection? This collection of poetry takes up various topics, for example, seasons.
Right. The Kokinshu set a pattern once and for all, not only for later royal anthologies, or for that matter, poetic anthologies of any kind, including Basho's haiku collections, Sarumino, Monkey's Raincoat, for example. But more widely, for the poetic, literary, or more generally, aesthetic sensibility of the Japanese. Apart from the Chinese Confucian classics, which are must-readings of the intellectuals, the Kokinshu was revered as the Japanese classic throughout pre-modern times, far more so than the Tale of Genji or the No Place, for example. You could safely say that later cultural products, whether they be poetry, narrative, play, painting, architecture, or tea ceremony, all more or less take for granted the reader's knowledge of the Kokinshu. People try to memorize the whole anthology, and court ladies were expected to know all the poems, Kokinshu poems, by heart. And it is said that an emperor tried his court ladies by this way.
He quizzed the ladies.
That's right. He recited the first part of a poem, and the court ladies had to pass the examination, had to say the rest of the poem.
Oh, I see. You had to be smart to pass as an Heian lady.
Haiku is known for setting great store by the sense of seasons. Very roughly speaking, that comes from the Kokinshu. Also, Japanese popular songs, especially the enka, which, as you know, is now a dying species, abound in laments for unrequited love, secret love, etc. That also comes from the Kokinshu. Let me explain. The two most important topics in the Kokinshu, as well as in Japanese popular songs today, are the seasons and love, or more exactly, the changes of the seasons and the pains of love. The anthology consists of 20 volumes, and the first 6 volumes, the most important of all, are dedicated to the seasons. 2 tomes for spring, 1 for summer, 2 for autumn, and 1 for winter. The poems are arranged by topics which follow temporal progression.
Yes.
This sort of ordering poems by topical association later gave rise to linked poetry. The autumn tone is the most voluminous. Autumn is and has been considered the most important, or at least most poetically inspiring, of the seasons in Japan. Needless to say, too, the sense of seasons is essential to Japanese architecture, painting, tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and not surprisingly, movies and popular songs. Characteristically, the full moon is not appreciated at all, nor are cherry blossoms in full bloom. As Yoshida Tenko, the author of Tsurezu Regusa, the Miscellany of Japanese Priests, circa 1331, says, "Are flowers something to look at only at their peak, and the moon only when flawlessly bright? And it is in their changing with passing occasions that makes everything touch one's soul. As regards the cherry blossoms, it was important to wait for the flowering or to deplore the falling petals, not the cherry blossoms in full glory. That's the interesting part of it.
And the thing is, I think we could still relate to it because the Japanese always like to be way in advance for their seasons, even today.
Oh, yes. And when the time comes, they're very happy.
Absolutely.
And then they start to worry about the change of the season.
And of course, the sense of season, we feel very strongly about the sense of seasons, but on the other hand, when we think of waka poems, we tend to associate waka poems with love poems.
That's right. The next most highly prized topic, love, occupies the 5 first volumes of the latter half of the collection, volumes 11 through 15. Love poems are also arranged to show the imagined progression of a love affair, starting with a yearning for someone merely known by hearsay, and ending with broken heart and even bitterness about love itself.
In that very, very small poem, we can fit it all within.
That's right. Yes, with all the poems arranged that way, you can see the whole progression of a love affair.
I see.
And the poems gradually build toward the climax, and they take a downward path. But curiously, there is nothing at the apex, not a single poem on the pure joy of love. Apparently, the Japanese don't find happy love as a worthy topic of a poem.
Now, the views that you have expressed are so interesting that I really like to hear samples of some of the poems, which I'm sure have been translated into English at some point. Maybe can you give us examples?
Sure. As I will say later, Kokishu, the most characteristic feature of Kokishu is wordplay. Kakekotoba is essential. So, as you can imagine, it is very hard to translate Kokishu poems into any other language. But I tried somehow to translate some of the poems into English, keeping the puns intact.
Oh.
So let's take an example. This is a love poem, Book 11, by an anonymous poet. This runs like this. Tobutori no koe mo kikoe no okuyama no fukaki kokoro o hito wa shiranan. And I translated this into English. A remote mountain where even the cry of a flying bird can't be heard. So deep an affection have I for you, I wish you to know. A remote mountain where even the cry of a flying bird can't be heard. So deep an affection have I for you, I wish you to know. Here the hitch word, kakekotoba, fukaki, deep, which appears in line 4 in the original Japanese, serves a double purpose. First, in the sense of lying far back, it completes, yes, or at least continues the first line of thought about the remote mountain, and then, in the sense of heartfelt, fukaki, initiates a second concerning the narrator's love. Thus, it works as a hitch yoking together two utterly different contexts. The gist of this waka is, of course, the confection of a hidden love, and the first 3 lines of the poem introduces it by paving the way for the keyword fukaki, deep. Hence the name of introductory phrase, jokotoba. generally speaking, wordplay, pun is held in very low esteem in Europe, in the Western world, and in Japan. For example, in John Dryden's view, Shakespeare, like Ben Jonson, is guilty of flaunting, I quote, the lowest and most groveling kind of which we call clenches.
Oh dear.
Unquote. That's pun. Despite the well-meaning efforts by such eminent writers as Shakespeare, Donne, and Joyce, not to mention the likes of Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear, pun has always been sneered at in the Western literary and rhetorical histories. But I must say that pun, kakekotoba, is really the key, often the sole poeticizing factor of a poem. So let me take another example of a Kokisho poem. Again, an anonymous love poem from the Kokisho. Waga sode ni madaki shigure no furinoru wa kimi ga kokoro ni aki ya kinoram. Again, I try to render this into English, but I have to make two versions to cover the both two meanings. An unseasonable cold shower falls on my sleeves. Is it that autumn has come to your heart? An unseasonable cold shower falls on my sleeves. Is it that autumn has come to your heart? The rain falling on one's sleeves is a long-established metaphor for copious tears. The main semantic stress of this poem is represented by the pun on aki, meaning both autumn and weariness, akita. This is a very useful pun. Thus, the line can also be rendered as, unexpectedly bitter tears fall down on my sleeves. Is it that you have grown tired of me? Unexpectedly bitter tears fall down on my sleeves. Is it that you have grown tired of me? This poem has a relatively simple structure, but it is typical of the waka genre in that it juxtaposes two different texts through one single punning word. Although it is only the second text that makes perfect sense, the love story, the first, the season and landscape context, runs parallel with it by strongly suggesting an ineffable semantic affinity with it. It should be emphasized that the first text does not exactly work in a metaphoric manner on the second. Metaphor, after all, does not need homophony for its justification. I mean, this state of this love affair is not like the falling rain or autumn or anything, but there is some kind of affinity between the scene and the story. Instead, the semantic affinity between these two texts, united by pun, might be said to be either vaguely analogical or contrastive, precisely like the effect achieved in a small way by rhyme in Western poetry, which, however, usually does not affect the whole text. Kakekotoba like this can be found everywhere in classical Japanese poetry, as well as in poetic prose.
Now, we have this wonderful, wonderful legacy, and we have this a wonderful collection of poetry. How could we pass on this wonderful world from our ancient medieval period to the rest of the world?
Well, for one thing, I must say that it is really hard to translate Kokisho poems into other languages. There are puns, wordplays, and of course there were attempts. As Mr. Miyamori Asataro translated Kokisho into English, and other British and American scholars made the attempt too, but I don't think they were truly successful. So to really delve into the beauties of the Kokisho poems, you have to learn Japanese.
Right.
The spirit of the Kokisho is in, for example, haiku and renku too. It's hard to explain, but the renku goes something like this. You write one short poem. I go on with another short poem, somewhat sticking to your poem.
So it becomes a chain of poems.
Right. But someone else, the third person, composes a third poem, which connects somewhat to the second poem, but in opposition to verse 1. You have to get away from the world composed by the first two verses. You have to stick to verse 2, but run away in the opposite direction with the verse 3. You understand?
It's very demanding.
Very demanding. And they go on like this till they compose 36 poems. So when they start, they don't know where they are going. In a way, so let's call the three verses A, B, and C. A and B combine together to make up a whole poem. B and C combine to make up a whole poem. But the world of B and C will have to be completely different from the world of A and B.
Mm.
For example, if A and B describe a scene, nocturnal scene, the picture made by B and C is a daytime scene, something like that.
Mm.
And why do I say this? Because in this case, verse B is a kind of pun. It faces both ways. Verse B works both ways. It can be understood in the context of A and B. It can be understood in the context of B and C, which are completely different. So I think this is the mainstream in Japanese poetry and even prose, deliberately misunderstanding some utterance, a poem.
Mm.
So any Japanese poem is open to all kinds of interpretations or even misinterpretations. It is open in the sense Umberto Eco expounds.
Oh.
He wrote a very wonderful book called Open Work. So I would maintain that in the terminacy of meaning, wordplay, you can't determine the meaning of a wordplay. It always evades your pinpointing. It always oscillates between this sense and that sense.
So it's a very fuzzy thing.
That's right. This kind of indeterminacy of meaning is a basic condition of human utterances, I would say. Endless semiosis, they call it endless semiosis. Understanding one thing leads to an understanding of that thing, and
It
like
goes
that.
on and on.
Right. It's not a doctrine, but a simple fact. Semantic undecidability of all text and speeches is far from being a weakness to be corrected or deplored. A keen and constant awareness that your words can be apprehended in unexpected ways. Like in the Renku, someone else would put a completely surprising verse to your own verse. A calm and benevolent readiness to allow for a variety of interpretations and misinterpretations by different people in different contexts, paradoxically, is the only hope we have left for true mutual understanding between different humans and different cultures. So I think that wordplay is a trivial thing, but there is something really important in this kind of verbal construct.
Very, very interesting, and this is something that we can learn from a collection of poems that was compiled 1,100 years ago.
Yes, I think so.
I see. Thank you very much for the very interesting thought.
Thank you.
That was Professor Koji Kawamoto, the president of Otemai University, interviewed by